The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Manchester as Sarah Whitworth hurried through the narrow streets, her wooden clogs echoing against the wet stones. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the great mill chimneys were already belching their black smoke into the grey sky above. The year was 1823, and Britain was transforming before everyone's eyes into something the world had never seen before, an industrial nation where the rhythm of life was no longer dictated by the sun and seasons, but by the relentless beat of steam engines and the clatter of machinery. Sarah, like thousands of other young women across the northern counties, was part of this great transformation. At 17, she had been working in Arkwright's cotton mill for 3 years, her nimble fingers tending to the spinning machines that produced the thread that would become the fabric clothing people across the British Empire and beyond. The work was hard and the hours long, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, 6 days a week. But it offered something that life in her parents' rural village had never provided: a steady wage and the possibility of independence. The industrial towns of the 1820s were unlike anything Britain had ever known. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Sheffield had grown from modest market towns into bustling centres of commerce and manufacturing. The population of Manchester alone had swelled from 75,000 in 1801 to over 180,000 by 1821, with people flooding in from the countryside seeking work in the new factories. These rapid changes brought both opportunity and hardship in equal measure. The streets of these industrial towns told the story of Britain's social transformation. Grand Georgian terraces housed the new class of factory owners and merchants, their elegant facades overlooking tree-lined squares where well-dressed ladies took their morning constitutional, accompanied by servants carrying their shopping baskets. These were the families who had grown wealthy from the profits of industry. Men like Joshua Hargreaves, who had parlayed his father's small textile business into a cotton empire that employed over 800 workers across 3 mills. But just a few streets away, the picture was starkly different. Row upon row of hastily built terraced houses, their walls blackened by industrial soot, housed the workers who made this prosperity possible. These homes, often no more than 2 rooms up and 2 down, sheltered entire families in conditions that would have been unthinkable to their rural ancestors. The lack of proper sanitation, clean water, and adequate ventilation made these areas breeding grounds for disease, and cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis claimed lives regularly. The contrast was perhaps most visible on a Sunday morning, when the different classes of British society made their way to church. The wealthy merchants and their families would arrive in polished carriages, the ladies dressed in silk gowns with elaborate bonnets, the gentlemen in fine wool coats and top hats. They would take their places in the best pews at the front of the church, their presence a testament to their social standing and God's supposed blessing on their endeavors. Meanwhile, the working families would walk to church, if they could afford the time off and had suitable clothes to wear. Many factories required Sunday work, and those lucky enough to have the day off often found themselves too exhausted to do anything but rest. When they did attend services, they sat in the back pews or in the gallery, listening to sermons that often emphasized the virtue of hard work and the importance of accepting one's station in life. Religion played a crucial role in 1820s British society, but it was changing along with everything else. The established Church of England still held official supremacy, but the growing industrial population was increasingly drawn to Methodist and other nonconformist churches that spoke more directly to their experiences and offered more emotional and participatory forms of worship. John Wesley's followers had grown from a small sect to a major religious force, with Methodist chapels springing up in working-class neighborhoods across the country. These religious divisions reflected deeper social and political tensions that were beginning to reshape British society. The old order, dominated by the landed aristocracy and the established church, was being challenged by the new industrial middle class and the growing working population. The reform movement was gathering momentum, demanding political representation for the new industrial towns and an end to the system where parliamentary seats could be bought and sold like commodities. In the countryside, change came more slowly but no less dramatically. The agricultural revolution had been transforming rural life for decades, with new farming techniques, crop rotations, and selective breeding producing unprecedented yields. Landowners like Sir William Ashby had enclosed thousands of acres of common land, creating large, efficient farms that could feed the growing urban population. But this efficiency came at a cost. thousands of rural laborers found themselves displaced, forced to seek work in the industrial towns or face destitution. Village life in the 1820s retained many of its traditional rhythms, but even here the influence of industrial change could be felt. The blacksmith still shod horses and mended tools, but he might also find himself repairing machinery brought from the nearest market town. The local parson still conducted services in the ancient parish church, but his sermons increasingly reflected the moral concerns of an industrial age, the importance of temperance, the dangers of radical politics, and the need for social harmony between the classes. Women's lives were being transformed perhaps more than anyone's. In rural areas, women had always worked, in the fields during harvest time, in cottage industries like spinning and weaving, and in countless domestic tasks that kept rural households functioning. But industrial work offered something different, the possibility of earning their own wages and achieving a degree of independence that had been unthinkable for previous generations of women. This independence, however limited, came with its own challenges. Factory work was physically demanding and often dangerous. The air in textile mills was thick with fiber dust that caused lung diseases, and the machinery operated with little in the way of safety guards. Young women like Sarah Whitworth learned to be constantly vigilant, keeping their hair covered and their skirts clear of the moving parts that could catch and maim in an instant. The working day in most industries began before dawn and ended after sunset. Factories were lit by oil lamps and, in the more modern establishments, gas lighting that cast an eerie glow over the working floors. The noise was constant and deafening, the clatter of looms, the hiss of steam engines, the shouting of overseers trying to make themselves heard above the din. Workers developed their own systems of communication, using hand signals and gestures to coordinate their efforts and warn of dangers. Mealtimes provided brief respites from the relentless pace of industrial work. Workers would gather in mill courtyards or designated eating areas, sharing simple meals of bread, cheese, and ale. These moments of social interaction were precious, allowing workers to share news, gossip, and complaints about working conditions. It was during these breaks that labor organization began to take root, as workers discovered that their individual grievances were shared by many others. The question of child labor was becoming increasingly contentious during this period. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked in factories, their small size making them ideal for crawling under machinery to collect cotton fibers or tie broken threads. The work was dangerous and the hours long, but for many families, the wages earned by children made the difference between survival and destitution. Reformers like Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, were beginning to campaign for restrictions on child labor. But these efforts met fierce resistance from factory owners who argued that such regulations would make British industry uncompetitive. Education was becoming a more pressing concern as literacy became increasingly valuable in an industrial economy. Sunday schools, originally established by religious groups to provide basic literacy training, were expanding rapidly. By the 1820s, hundreds of thousands of children across Britain attended Sunday schools where they learned to read using the Bible as their primary text. Some forward-thinking employers established day schools for their workers' children, recognizing that a more educated workforce would ultimately be more productive. The growth of industrial towns created new patterns of consumption and leisure that would have been foreign to previous generations. Public houses multiplied to serve the thirsty workers, often becoming centers of social life and political discussion. Music halls began to appear, offering entertainment that ranged from popular songs to theatrical performances. Street vendors sold everything from hot pies to penny newspapers, creating a vibrant urban culture that contrasted sharply with the quiet rhythms of rural life. Transportation was undergoing its own revolution during this period. The canal system, built primarily to transport coal and manufactured goods, had created new networks of communication and commerce. Canal boats, pulled by horses walking along towpaths, carried not just cargo but passengers and mail, linking previously isolated communities to the wider world. The Great Canals, the Grand Union, the Leeds-Liverpool, the Bridgewater, became highways of industrial development, their locks and aqueducts monuments to British engineering skill. But even as the canals reached their peak of importance, a new form of transportation was beginning to emerge that would soon eclipse them entirely. George Stephenson's locomotive, the Rocket, had demonstrated the potential of steam-powered rail transport, and investors were beginning to fund the construction of railway lines that would connect the major industrial centers. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, would herald the beginning of the railway age, but in the 1820s, this transformation was still in its early stages. The social changes brought by industrialization created new forms of wealth and poverty that existed side by side in Britain's growing cities. Successful merchants and manufacturers built themselves grand homes in fashionable districts, complete with servants' quarters, libraries, and drawing rooms where they could entertain their peers and display their prosperity. These homes were furnished with the finest products of British craftsmanship, mahogany furniture, fine china, silver plate, and carpets woven in the very mills that provided their owners wealth. Yet the wealth of the industrial elite was built on the labor of thousands of workers who lived in conditions of unprecedented urban crowding and environmental degradation. The smoky atmosphere of industrial towns was a constant presence, staining buildings black and contributing to respiratory ailments that plagued the working population. Rivers and streams became polluted with industrial waste, and the lack of adequate sewage systems meant that disease spread rapidly through densely packed working-class neighborhoods. Despite these hardships, there was also a sense of possibility and progress that permeated British society in the 1820s. The nation was emerging victorious from the Napoleonic Wars, and British industry was beginning to dominate global markets. The Royal Navy protected British merchant ships as they carried manufactured goods to every corner of the world, returning with raw materials and exotic products that filled British homes and stimulated British imaginations. The British Empire was expanding, and news of distant lands and peoples filtered back through letters from colonial administrators, military officers, and adventurous merchants. India, the jewel of the empire, provided cotton for British mills and markets for British goods. The West Indies supplied sugar that sweetened British tea, while Canada provided timber for British shipbuilding. This global reach gave even ordinary British people a sense that they were part of something larger and more significant than their individual lives. As the 1820s progressed, it became increasingly clear that Britain was experiencing changes that would reshape not just the British Isles, but the entire world. The industrial techniques pioneered in British factories would spread to other countries. The social and political ideas generated by industrial society would challenge traditional forms of government and social organization, and the economic relationships forged by British commerce would create the first truly global economy. For people like Sarah Whitworth, walking through the smoky streets of Manchester in the early morning light, these grand historical transformations were less important than the immediate realities of daily life: finding steady work, keeping healthy, and perhaps saving enough money to improve her situation. But their individual stories were part of a larger narrative of human progress and struggle that would define the modern age. The Britain of the 1820s stood at a crucial turning point, balanced between its agricultural past and its industrial future, between tradition and innovation, between the promise of progress and the reality of social upheaval. Understanding this period requires seeing it through the eyes of the people who lived through these transformative years, experiencing both the opportunities and the challenges that came with being part of the world's first industrial society. The great bell of St. Mary's Church struck 7 times as Lord Pemberton's carriage rolled through the gates of Ashford Manor, its wheels crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel drive. The November morning was crisp and clear, and from the windows of his Georgian mansion, the Earl could see across perfectly manicured lawns to the rolling hills of his Derbyshire estate. This was the world of the British aristocracy in the 1820s, a world of inherited privilege, landed wealth, and social responsibility that had remained largely unchanged for generations, even as the country around it transformed with unprecedented speed. Inside the manor, the daily routine unfolded with the precision of clockwork. By 6 in the morning, the household staff were already at work, the scullery maids lighting fires in the great kitchen ranges, the housemaids dusting and polishing the public rooms, and the stable boys preparing the horses for the day's activities. The rigid hierarchy of domestic service that governed great houses like Ashford Manor reflected in miniature the social order of British society as a whole. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, ruled over the female servants with an iron hand, her large bunch of keys symbolizing her authority over the household's domestic arrangements. She had risen to her position through years of faithful service, beginning as a kitchen maid at 14 and gradually earning the trust and respect necessary to manage a staff of 30 servants. Her counterpart, Mr. Jameson the butler, oversaw the male servants and managed the complex social rituals that governed aristocratic entertaining. The contrast between upstairs and downstairs life was stark but not absolute. While Lord Pemberton enjoyed the privileges of wealth and position, he also bore responsibilities that shaped his daily routine as surely as industrial work shaped the lives of factory workers. As a justice of the peace, he spent several mornings each week hearing cases brought by local constables, disputes between neighbors, petty thefts, and cases of drunkenness that disrupted village life. As a major landowner, he needed to make decisions about crop rotations, tenant farmers, leases, and improvements to estate infrastructure. The breakfast table at Ashford Manor groaned under the weight of traditional English fare: thick-cut bacon from pigs raised on the estate, eggs from the Manor's henhouse, fresh bread baked in the estate's own bakery, and strong tea imported from the family's connections and salon. This abundance stood in sharp contrast to the meager breakfasts of working families, who might share a loaf of bread and a pot of weak tea among several family members. Lady Pemberton's morning began with the arrival of her lady's maid, who helped her dress in the elaborate fashion required of a woman of her station. The complex undergarments, stays, and multiple layers of clothing that made up a lady's attire in the 1820s required assistance to put on properly. Her dress, made from silk imported from China and trimmed with lace from Belgium, cost more than a factory worker would earn in several years. Yet she wore it as naturally as a working woman wore her simple cotton dress, each reflecting their position in society's carefully ordered hierarchy. The gulf between rich and poor was perhaps most visible in matters of health and hygiene. The wealthy had access to private physicians who, while their medical knowledge was limited by the standards of later centuries, could at least provide personal attention and expensive remedies. They lived in houses with multiple fireplaces, ensuring warmth during the harsh British winters, and employed servants who maintained standards of cleanliness that were impossible for working families to achieve. Dr. Williams, who served the Pemberton family and other wealthy households in the county, represented the growing professionalization of medicine that was occurring during this period. He had studied at Edinburgh University, one of the leading medical schools of the time, and kept current with the latest theories about disease and treatment. Though he still prescribed remedies that would later be recognized as useless or even harmful, bloodletting, purging, and various patent medicines, he also advocated for the fresh air, good nutrition, and sanitation that wealthy families could afford. For working families, medical care was a luxury they could rarely afford. Folk remedies, passed down through generations, provided the primary response to illness and injury. Village-wise women, who combined practical experience with traditional herbal knowledge, served as the main source of medical care for rural communities. In industrial towns, some progressive employers provided basic medical care for their workers, recognizing that healthy workers were more productive workers. The differences in diet between social classes were dramatic. The wealthy enjoyed a varied diet that included meat at most meals, fresh vegetables from their own gardens, and exotic imports like sugar, spices, and tropical fruits. A typical dinner at a great house might include several courses: soup, fish, various meat dishes, vegetables, and elaborate desserts, accompanied by fine wines from France and port from Portugal. Working families, by contrast, subsisted primarily on bread, potatoes, and occasional bacon or cheese. Tea had become the national beverage across all social classes, but working families often had to make do with weak brews using tea leaves that had been used multiple times. Sugar was expensive enough that many families reserved it for special occasions, sweetening their tea with treacle or going without. The rhythm of rural life still followed the ancient patterns of agricultural work, despite the changes brought by improved farming techniques. Harvest time remained a period of intense community activity, when entire villages would work together to bring in the crops that would sustain them through the winter months. The Harvest Festival, celebrated in parish churches across the country, maintained its importance as a time of thanksgiving and community celebration. But even in the countryside, the influence of industrial change could be felt. Market towns that served rural areas were growing and changing, as merchants who had made their fortunes in manufacturing began to build impressive homes and challenge the social dominance of the traditional landed gentry. The weekly market days became opportunities not just for buying and selling agricultural products, but for exchanging news and ideas that connected rural communities to the wider world of political and social change. Village life retained many of its traditional features, but new elements were being introduced that reflected the changing times. Lending libraries, supported by subscription from local gentlemen, brought books and periodicals to educated villagers who hungered for information about the world beyond their immediate experience. Local newspapers, made possible by improvements in printing technology and transportation, provided regular news about national and international events. The public house remained the center of social life for working men, both in rural villages and industrial towns. These establishments served as unofficial community centers where men gathered after work to share news, discuss politics, and find relief from the hardships of daily life. The consumption of alcohol was enormous by later standards. Beer was considered safer to drink than water in many areas, and gin was cheap enough that even the poorest workers could afford to drink themselves into temporary oblivion. Women's social lives were more restricted, regardless of their social class. Wealthy women had elaborate social rituals, morning calls, afternoon tea parties, and formal dinners that filled their days with carefully choreographed interactions. These social activities were not merely entertainment but served important functions in maintaining family status and arranging advantageous marriages for their children. Working women had fewer formal social opportunities, but they created their own networks through shared work experiences and neighborhood relationships. The tradition of lying in, when women in a community would take turns helping new mothers with household tasks and childcare, provided both practical support and social connection. Wash day, when women would gather at communal washing facilities or riverbanks, became another opportunity for social interaction and the exchange of news and gossip. Marriage customs varied significantly between social classes but followed recognizable patterns across British society. Among the wealthy, marriages were often arranged or at least heavily influenced by considerations of property, family status, and social advantage. Young people of the upper classes met potential spouses at carefully chaperoned social events, balls, house parties, and formal visits, where their interactions were governed by elaborate rules of etiquette. Working-class courtship was more informal but no less serious in its implications. Young men and women might meet at work, at church social events, or through family connections. The tradition of walking out, taking supervised evening strolls, provided opportunities for couples to get to know each other while maintaining social respectability. Marriage represented economic as well as emotional partnership, as couples needed to combine their resources to establish independent households. The legal and social position of women was severely restricted throughout British society, but the specific nature of these restrictions varied by class. Wealthy women were protected from many of the hardships of life but were also more severely constrained by social expectations and legal limitations. Upon marriage, a woman's property became her husband's, and she had no legal rights to her children or even to protection from domestic violence. Working women, while facing their own forms of discrimination and limitation, often had more practical independence than their wealthy sisters. Factory work, despite its hardships, provided wages that belonged to the women who earned them, though fathers and husbands often claimed the right to control these earnings. Some women in industrial towns managed to establish small businesses, taking in washing, selling baked goods, or providing seamstress services, that gave them economic independence rare among women of any class. Education reflected and reinforced social hierarchies while also beginning to challenge them. The sons of wealthy families were educated at prestigious public schools like Eton, Harrow, and Rugby, where they learned Latin and Greek, developed connections with their social peers, and absorbed the values of gentlemanly conduct that would guide them throughout their lives. These schools produced the administrators, military officers, and political leaders who governed Britain and its growing empire. The daughters of wealthy families received a different kind of education, focused on the accomplishments considered appropriate for ladies: French, music, drawing, and the social graces necessary for managing households and entertaining guests. This education was designed to make them attractive marriage partners rather than to prepare them for independent careers or intellectual pursuits. Working-class education was more limited but was beginning to expand during this period. Sunday schools provided basic literacy training for hundreds of thousands of children, using religious texts to teach reading and moral instruction. Some enlightened employers established day schools for their workers' children, recognizing that education could produce more skilled and reliable workers. The monitorial system, developed by Joseph Lancaster and Andrew Bell, made it possible to provide basic education to large numbers of children with limited resources. In this system, older and more advanced students taught younger ones under the supervision of a single teacher, making it possible to educate hundreds of children in a single school. While the quality of education was often poor by later standards, it represented a significant advance in making literacy available to working-class children. Popular entertainment in the 1820s reflected the social divisions of British society while also providing rare opportunities for different classes to mingle. Country fairs, held annually in market towns across Britain, brought together people from all walks of life for several days of celebration, commerce, and entertainment. These events featured everything from livestock competitions and produce contests to puppet shows, acrobats, and traveling theatrical troupes. In London and other major cities, the theatre provided entertainment for different social classes, though they rarely mixed in the same venues. The patent theatres, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, presented serious dramas and operas for fashionable audiences, while smaller venues offered melodramas, farces, and variety shows that appealed to working-class patrons. The popularity of boxing matches, cockfights, and other blood sports crossed class boundaries, though the wealthy often attended from private boxes while workers crowded into general admission areas. Music played an important role in British life across all social classes. Wealthy families maintained pianos in their drawing rooms, and young ladies were expected to develop sufficient skill to provide entertainment for family and guests. Folk music traditions remained strong in rural areas, with ballads and dance tunes passed down through generations providing entertainment at weddings, harvest celebrations, and other community gatherings. The growth of Methodist and other nonconformist religious movements brought new forms of musical expression that combined religious devotion with popular appeal. Methodist hymns, written by Charles Wesley and others, used familiar melodies and simple, emotionally direct language that made them accessible to people regardless of their educational background or social position. Reading habits also reflected social stratification while contributing to gradual changes in British culture. The wealthy maintained private libraries and subscribed to expensive periodicals that kept them informed about literature, politics, and intellectual developments. The growth of circulating libraries made novels and other popular literature available to middle-class readers, while the expansion of newspaper publishing brought regular news and opinion to an ever-widening readership. Working-class readers, when they were literate, often shared books and periodicals among extended families and neighborhood networks. Chapbooks, small, cheaply produced pamphlets containing ballads, fairy tales, and sensational stories, provided entertainment that was affordable even for people with very limited income. The radical press, despite government attempts at suppression, found audiences among working-class readers hungry for political information and alternative perspectives on social conditions. By the mid-1820s, it was becoming clear that British society was experiencing changes that went far beyond simple economic transformation. The relationships between social classes, the role of women, the nature of work and leisure, and the very conception of what it meant to be British were all evolving in response to the pressures and opportunities created by industrial development. These changes created both excitement and anxiety among people at all levels of society. The possibilities for social mobility, individual achievement, and material progress were greater than ever before in British history. But so too were the possibilities for social conflict, economic instability, and the breakdown of traditional values and relationships that had provided stability and meaning for countless generations. The Britain of the 1820s was a society in transition, caught between an agricultural past and an industrial future, between traditional hierarchies and emerging democratic ideals, between local identities and national consciousness. Understanding this crucial decade requires appreciating both the continuities that linked it to Britain's past and the innovations that pointed toward its future. The torchlight flickered across the faces of 500 men gathered in the field outside Birmingham on a cold October evening in 1824. Thomas Atwood, the banker-turned-reformer, stood on a makeshift platform addressing the crowd about political reform, his voice carrying across the assembled workers and middle-class citizens who had come to hear his message. This was the face of political change in 1820s Britain, not violent revolution, but organized, persistent pressure for reform that would eventually transform the nature of British government and society. The political system that governed Britain in the 1820s was an ancient one, little changed since the medieval period despite the dramatic social and economic transformations of the previous half-century. The House of Commons was supposed to represent the people, but in reality it represented a system of privilege and patronage that bore little relationship to the distribution of population and wealth in industrial Britain. Manchester, with its 180,000 inhabitants and massive industrial output, had no member of parliament, while Old Sarum, an uninhabited hill in Wiltshire, elected 2 MPs who were chosen by a single landowner. This system of rotten boroughs and pocket boroughs had created a parliament dominated by the landed aristocracy and their allies, men who had little understanding of or sympathy for the needs of the growing industrial population. The great Whig families, the Grenvilles, the Cavendishes, the Russells, controlled dozens of parliamentary seats through their ownership of land and their networks of patronage and influence. Even many of the seats that were theoretically contested were effectively controlled by wealthy patrons who could determine the outcome through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and social pressure. The exclusion of Catholics from political participation added another layer of injustice to the system. Despite making up a significant portion of the population, particularly in Ireland, Catholics were barred from sitting in Parliament or holding most government offices. This disability affected not just Irish Catholics but also the growing number of Catholic families in England and Scotland, including some ancient aristocratic houses that had remained loyal to the Old Faith despite centuries of persecution. Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish advocate, had emerged as the leader of the campaign for Catholic emancipation, using legal expertise and mass organization to build pressure for change. His Catholic Association collected subscriptions from poor Irish peasants and urban workers, creating a political organization that could influence elections and maintain constant pressure on the government. O'Connell's victory in the Clare election of 1828, despite being legally unable to take his seat as a Catholic, demonstrated the power of organized popular political action. The question of reform was not simply a matter of abstract political principle but had profound implications for the daily lives of ordinary British people. The unreformed Parliament consistently opposed measures that would improve conditions for industrial workers, protect children from exploitation, or address the growing problems of urban poverty and public health. Factory owners who dominated local politics in unrepresented industrial towns could prevent the passage of regulations that might cut into their profits, while landed interests in Parliament blocked measures that might benefit urban populations at the expense of agricultural concerns. Robert Peel, the Home Secretary during much of the 1820s, represented a new type of political figure, a man whose family fortune came from cotton manufacturing rather than landed estates, and who combined conservative instincts with a practical recognition that some reforms were necessary to maintain social stability. His creation of the Metropolitan Police Force in 1829 reflected this pragmatic approach to change, addressing the real problems of crime and disorder in London while also providing a model for law enforcement that other cities would eventually adopt. The Bow Street runners and the various parish constables who had previously maintained order in London were clearly inadequate to deal with the challenges of a city approaching 1 million inhabitants. Crime was rampant, particularly in the overcrowded districts of the East End, where pickpockets, burglars, and footpads operated with relative impunity. The new police force, with its distinctive blue uniforms and organized structure, represented a professional approach to law enforcement that was gradually accepted by a population initially suspicious of anything that resembled a standing army. Popular political movements in the 1820s took many forms, from the respectable reform associations led by middle-class professionals to the more radical groups that advocated for universal suffrage and fundamental changes in the distribution of property. The boundary between legal political activity and sedition was often unclear, and the government's response to popular protest ranged from tolerance to violent suppression depending on the perceived threat to public order. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 cast a long shadow over popular politics in the following decade. The cavalry charge that had killed 11 peaceful protesters and wounded hundreds more at St. Peter's Field in Manchester had demonstrated the government's willingness to use force against its own citizens, but it had also created martyrs for the cause of reform and strengthened the determination of political activists across the country. Henry Hunt, the radical orator who had been speaking at Peterloo when the cavalry attacked, spent several years in prison for his role in the meeting but emerged as a powerful symbol of resistance to government oppression. His imprisonment, along with that of other radical leaders, only served to increase their popularity among working-class supporters who saw them as champions of their rights and interests. The radical press played a crucial role in spreading political ideas and coordinating opposition to the government. Publications like the Political Register, edited by William Cobbett, and The Black Dwarf, published by Thomas Jonathan Wooler, reached thousands of readers despite government attempts to suppress them through prosecutions and punitive taxation. These publications provided alternative perspectives on current events and challenged the official narratives promoted by the government and the established press. Cobbett's Political Register was particularly influential among rural readers, as his tours of the countryside and his sympathetic descriptions of agricultural workers' conditions gave him credibility that more urban radicals lacked. His critique of the old corruption, the system of sinecures, pensions, and patronage that enriched government supporters at public expense, resonated with readers who saw their own hard work producing wealth that seemed to benefit everyone except themselves. The struggle for press freedom was intimately connected to broader questions of political reform and popular rights. The government's attempts to control radical publications through the prosecution of editors and publishers, the imposition of heavy stamp duties that made newspapers expensive, and the threat of transportation or imprisonment for seditious libel created a climate of tension and resistance that politicized many previously apolitical citizens. Trade unions, though still illegal under the Combination Acts, were beginning to organize in the new industrial centers despite the risks of prosecution and imprisonment. The skilled artisans who formed the backbone of early labor organization, weavers, spinners, millwrights, and other craftsmen, had seen their traditional privileges and independence threatened by mechanization and factory discipline. Their attempts to maintain wage levels and working conditions through collective action often brought them into direct conflict with employers and magistrates. The London Corresponding Society and similar organizations in other cities provided models for working-class political organization that would later influence the development of Chartism and other mass movements. These societies combined educational activities, teaching literacy, discussing political theory, and distributing radical literature, with practical organizing work aimed at building support for parliamentary reform and other political changes. Women's participation in political movements was limited by legal restrictions and social conventions, but it was not non-existent. The female reform societies that emerged in industrial towns during this period provided platforms for women to express their political views and support male relatives who faced prosecution for their political activities. These organizations also gave women experience in public speaking, fundraising, and political organization that would prove valuable in later campaigns for women's rights. Religious questions intersected with political ones in complex ways during this period. The established Church of England remained closely connected to the political system, with bishops sitting in the House of Lords and clergy often serving as magistrates in rural areas. But the growth of Methodism and other dissenting denominations created constituencies that were increasingly dissatisfied with their exclusion from political power and their obligation to support the established church through tithes and church rates. The campaign for Catholic emancipation revealed deep-seated prejudices and fears that went beyond simple religious differences. Protestant opponents of emancipation argued that Catholics could not be trusted with political power because their ultimate loyalty was to the Pope rather than to the British Crown. This "no popery" sentiment had deep roots in British history and culture, reflecting centuries of conflict between Protestant Britain and Catholic powers in Europe. Anti-Catholic sentiment was particularly strong among working-class Protestants, who feared that Catholic emancipation would be followed by Irish Catholic immigration that would depress wages and compete for jobs. The Orange Order and similar organizations provided focal points for Protestant working-class opposition to Catholic rights, creating cross-class alliances between Protestant employers and workers that complicated the development of class-based political movements. The eventual passage of Catholic emancipation in 1829 represented a significant victory for the principle of religious tolerance, But it also demonstrated the power of organized popular pressure to force political change even against the preferences of the political establishment. The Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel, both previously opposed to emancipation, recognized that the alternative might be civil war in Ireland and reluctantly supported the measure that they had long resisted. Economic questions were inseparable from political ones during this period of rapid industrial growth and social change. The debate over the Corn Laws illustrated how political power could be used to protect the interests of particular social classes at the expense of others. These tariffs on imported grain kept food prices artificially high, benefiting landowners who received higher rents from their agricultural tenants but imposing severe hardship on working families who spent the majority of their income on bread and other basic foodstuffs. The Anti-Corn Law League, though it would not reach its full strength until the 1840s, was already beginning to organize during the late 1820s. Manufacturers like Richard Cobden and John Bright argued that free trade would benefit both employers and workers by reducing the cost of living and opening new markets for British manufactured goods. Their campaign combined economic arguments with moral appeals, presenting the Corn Laws as a form of class legislation that sacrificed the welfare of the many to the profits of the few. Banking and currency questions also generated intense political debate during this period. The resumption of gold payments in 1821, after their suspension during the Napoleonic Wars, caused deflation and economic hardship that particularly affected debtors and small farmers. The country banks that had proliferated during the war years began to fail, causing financial panics that destroyed the savings of middle-class families and threw thousands of workers out of employment. David Ricardo's economic theories, though abstract and difficult for non-specialists to understand, had practical implications for political debate about wages, profits, and economic policy. His iron law of wages, which suggested that workers' pay would always tend toward subsistence level, was used by opponents of labor organization to argue that strikes and unions were futile attempts to resist economic natural law. Thomas Malthus' essay on population provided another theoretical framework that influenced political debate about poverty and social policy. His argument that population growth would always outstrip food production unless checked by war, famine, or moral restraint was used to oppose poor relief and other measures designed to help the destitute. This scientific approach to social questions gave opponents of reform intellectual respectability while justifying policies that might otherwise seem heartlessly cruel. The poor law system that had developed over centuries was coming under increasing strain as industrial development created new forms of poverty and social dislocation. The Speenhamland system, which supplemented low wages with parish relief, was criticized for encouraging employers to pay below subsistence wages while burdening ratepayers with the cost of supporting the working poor. Rural parishes complained that they were being forced to support unemployed workers who had been displaced by industrial development in distant towns. The settlement laws that tied paupers to their parishes of birth created additional hardships for workers who needed to move in search of employment. These laws were designed to prevent parishes from being burdened with supporting people who had no historic connection to the area, but they also prevented the free movement of labor that industrial development required. Workers who fell on hard times might find themselves forcibly returned to parishes they had left years earlier, separated from family members and employment opportunities. Workhouses, originally designed to provide employment for the able-bodied poor, had become warehouses for the destitute that offered little hope of rehabilitation or improvement. The conditions in these institutions were deliberately harsh, based on the theory that poor relief should be less attractive than the lowest paid employment. But this approach often trapped people in cycles of poverty and desperation that made their eventual return to independent labor more difficult rather than easier. Crime and punishment reflected the social tensions and class conflicts of the period. The criminal law was extraordinarily harsh, with over 200 offenses punishable by death, including relatively minor property crimes like sheep stealing and pickpocketing. This bloody code was defended by conservatives as necessary to protect property in a society where traditional social controls were breaking down. But critics argued that its severity made juries reluctant to convict and encouraged more serious crimes by making the penalties for minor and major offenses similar. The transportation system sent thousands of convicts to Australia and other colonies, where they provided forced labor for colonial development while supposedly being reformed through hard work and moral instruction. This system served multiple purposes, removing criminals from British society, providing labor for colonial expansion, and creating the possibility of redemption and eventual prosperity for convicts who completed their sentences successfully. Newgate Prison and similar institutions in other cities were overcrowded, unsanitary, and brutal places where debtors and petty criminals were confined alongside murderers and other violent offenders. John Howard's prison reform movement had begun to influence conditions in some institutions, but progress was slow and uneven. The principle that imprisonment should reform as well as punish was gradually gaining acceptance, but the practical implementation of this ideal remained limited. Public executions remained popular entertainment that drew crowds of thousands to witness the final moments of condemned criminals. These spectacles were defended as moral instruction that would deter potential lawbreakers, but critics argued that they brutalized spectators and created sympathy for criminals rather than respect for law. The rituals surrounding execution, the final speeches, the religious ministrations, the crowd's reactions, reflected complex attitudes toward justice, mercy, and social order. Transportation infrastructure was beginning to transform British society in ways that went far beyond simple convenience. The improvement of roads through turnpike trusts had reduced travel times and made possible the development of regular coaching services that connected previously isolated communities to national networks of communication and commerce. The mail coaches that carried letters and newspapers to every corner of the kingdom created a sense of national unity and shared experience that had not existed in previous centuries. Canal building had reached its peak during this period, with engineering marvels like the Pont-Silt aqueduct and the Caledonian Canal demonstrating British technical expertise while creating new possibilities for industrial development. The narrow boats that plied these waterways carried not just coal and manufactured goods but also families of boat people who developed their own distinctive culture and customs. These floating communities maintained connections across vast distances while remaining somewhat apart from the settled populations of the towns and villages they served. The coaching inns that served travelers on the improved roads became centers of news and gossip, where information from London and other major cities filtered down to rural areas and market towns. The arrival of the mail coach was a daily event that brought communities into contact with the wider world of politics, commerce, and culture. These establishments also provided employment for ostlers, coachmen, and inn servants who formed an important part of the service economy that was growing alongside industrial production. Scientific and technological progress during the 1820s laid the groundwork for further developments that would transform British society in the following decades. The work of scientists like Michael Faraday in electricity and magnetism, Charles Lyell in geology, and John Dalton in atomic theory established Britain as a leader in scientific research and discovery. The Royal Society and similar institutions provided forums for the exchange of ideas and the promotion of scientific education among the educated classes. Medical advances, though limited by later standards, were beginning to improve health outcomes for those who could afford professional care. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccination was gradually gaining acceptance despite initial skepticism and resistance from both medical practitioners and the general public. The understanding of contagious diseases remained primitive, but practical measures like quarantine and improved sanitation were beginning to reduce the impact of epidemics in some areas. The expansion of literacy and education created new audiences for scientific and technical knowledge. Mechanics' institutes, established in industrial towns to provide education for working men, offered lectures on scientific subjects and maintained libraries of technical books and periodicals. These institutions reflected the growing recognition that industrial progress required a more educated workforce, while also satisfying workers' hunger for knowledge and self-improvement. Popular science lectures drew audiences that included both middle-class professionals and skilled workers eager to understand the principles underlying the technological changes that were transforming their world. The Royal Institution's Friday evening discourses, established by Count Rumford and continued under the direction of scientists like Humphrey Davy, provided models for scientific education that were copied in provincial cities throughout Britain. The relationship between science, technology, and industrial development was becoming increasingly close during this period. Steam engine improvements by engineers like Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson were based on scientific understanding of thermodynamics and mechanical principles, while the needs of industry provided incentives for further research and development. This connection between theoretical knowledge and practical application would become one of the defining characteristics of modern industrial society. As the 1820s drew to a close, it was becoming clear that Britain was experiencing changes that would have profound implications not just for British society but for the entire world. The political reforms that began with Catholic emancipation would lead eventually to the Great Reform Act and the gradual democratization of British politics. The industrial techniques and social relationships pioneered in British factories and cities would spread to other countries, creating a global industrial civilization. The intellectual and cultural developments of this decade would influence thinking about politics, economics, and society for generations to come. The men and women who lived through these transformative years could hardly have imagined the full implications of the changes they were witnessing and participating in. But their struggles for political representation, economic security, and social justice established patterns of organization and resistance that would shape popular politics throughout the modern era. Their achievements in science, technology, and industry created the foundation for unprecedented material progress and social change. Their debates about the proper relationship between individual liberty and social order, between economic efficiency and social justice, between tradition and innovation, established terms of discussion that remain relevant to contemporary political and social questions. Understanding the 1820s requires appreciating both the specific historical circumstances of that decade and the broader patterns of change that it exemplified. This was a society in transition, experiencing both the benefits and the costs of being the world's first industrial civilization, struggling to adapt ancient institutions and values to radically new conditions, and laying the groundwork for the modern world that would emerge in the following centuries. The gaslight flickered across the pages of Lord Byron's latest poem as Elizabeth Thornton settled into her favorite chair in the drawing room of her family's London townhouse. It was a March evening in 1824, and outside the tall windows, the sounds of the great metropolis continued their relentless symphony. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the calls of late-night vendors, and the distant rumble of wheels carrying goods and people through streets that never truly slept. This was the cultural heart of an empire that stretched across the globe, where ideas and artistic expressions were being forged that would shape not only British society but influence the entire world. The Romantic movement that dominated British literature and arts during the 1820s reflected the profound changes occurring in society and the human spirit. Writers like Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats captured the era's sense of possibility and rebellion, its fascination with emotion and imagination over reason and tradition. Their works spoke to a generation that was witnessing the transformation of everything familiar, from the landscape itself, scarred by mining and manufacturing, to the ancient rhythms of rural life disrupted by industrial development. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published just a few years earlier, had already become a sensation that captured the era's anxieties about scientific progress and social change. The novel's themes, the dangers of unbridled ambition, the responsibilities of creators toward their creations, the potential for scientific knowledge to unleash forces beyond human control, resonated with readers who were watching steam engines and factory systems reshape their world in ways that seemed both miraculous and threatening. The literary culture of the 1820s was sustained by a network of publishers, booksellers, and circulating libraries that made books available to a growing reading public. John Murray, the publisher of Byron's works, had built a literary empire that extended across Britain and into Europe, demonstrating how cultural products could be marketed and distributed on an unprecedented scale. The success of novels, poetry, and periodical literature created new career opportunities for writers while also establishing literature as a form of entertainment and intellectual stimulation that competed with traditional forms of popular culture. The Edinburgh Review and similar periodical publications provided forums for political and literary debate that shaped educated opinion throughout Britain. These quarterly journals combined book reviews with essays on contemporary issues, creating a space where political economy, literature, philosophy, and social questions could be discussed by contributors who included many of the leading intellectuals of the day. Francis Jeffrey, the editor of the Edinburgh Review, wielded influence that extended far beyond Scotland, as his judgments on new books and his opinions on political questions were read and discussed in drawing rooms and coffeehouses across the kingdom. The theatre remained one of the most popular forms of entertainment, despite persistent moral objections from evangelical Christians who viewed dramatic performances as corrupting influences on public morality. Covent Garden and Drury Lane, the two patent theatres in London, presented serious dramas and operas for fashionable audiences, while smaller theatres offered melodramas, farces, and musical entertainments that appealed to broader constituencies. The popularity of actors like Edmund Kean, whose passionate performances revolutionized Shakespearean acting, demonstrated the theatre's power to move and inspire audiences across social boundaries. Provincial theatres in cities like Bath, York, and Norwich provided employment for touring companies and local performers while bringing metropolitan culture to regional audiences. The circuit system allowed actors and actresses to develop their skills while serving communities that might otherwise have little access to professional dramatic entertainment. These provincial theatres also served as training grounds for performers who might eventually make their way to London stages, creating networks of cultural exchange that connected the capital to distant corners of the kingdom. Music occupied a central place in British cultural life across all social classes. The piano, which was becoming more affordable thanks to improved manufacturing techniques, could be found in middle-class homes throughout the country, where young ladies were expected to develop sufficient skill to provide entertainment for family and guests. Sheet music publishers like Museo Clementi built successful businesses by producing simplified arrangements of popular opera arias and dance tunes that could be performed by amateur musicians. Folk music traditions remained strong in rural areas and industrial communities, where ballads and dance tunes provided entertainment at weddings, harvest celebrations, and other social gatherings. The industrial work songs that emerged in factories and mines created new forms of musical expression that helped workers coordinate their efforts and maintain morale during long hours of repetitive labor. These songs often contained social and political commentary, expressing workers' grievances and aspirations in forms that could evade official censorship. The expansion of newspaper and periodical publishing created unprecedented opportunities for writers and journalists while also transforming the nature of public debate and political consciousness. The Times, under the editorship of Thomas Barnes, had established itself as the most influential newspaper in Britain, with correspondents throughout Europe and a circulation that reached into tens of thousands. Its famous thundering editorials could influence government policy and shape public opinion on questions ranging from foreign affairs to domestic economic policy. Provincial newspapers multiplied during this period, serving regional readerships with combinations of local news, parliamentary reports, and commentary on national issues. These publications created new forms of community identity and political awareness, as people in different parts of the country could follow the same stories and participate in national conversations about politics and social questions. The expansion of literacy, particularly among the middle classes and skilled workers, created audiences for these publications while also generating demand for books, pamphlets, and other forms of printed material. The British Empire, which by the 1820s encompassed vast territories across the globe, profoundly influenced domestic culture and society in ways that touched the lives of people who would never travel beyond their native villages. The great country houses of the aristocracy were filled with furniture made from colonial woods, decorated with Chinese porcelain and Indian textiles, and stocked with libraries containing accounts of exotic lands and peoples. These material objects and cultural products created a sense of Britain's global reach and importance that pervaded domestic life. The East India Company, which governed much of the Indian subcontinent as a private corporation, sent back regular communications that found their way into British newspapers and periodical literature. Accounts of military campaigns, descriptions of local customs and religions, and reports of commercial opportunities created a body of knowledge about India that fascinated British readers while also justifying imperial expansion and control. The nabobs who returned to Britain with fortunes made in India became figures of both envy and suspicion, representing the possibilities and moral complexities of imperial wealth. The West Indies, which provided sugar for British tables and vast profits for plantation owners, remained central to British economic life despite growing moral concerns about slavery. The campaign for the abolition of the slave trade, successfully concluded in 1807, had been followed by efforts to end slavery itself throughout the British Empire. William Wilberforce and other abolitionists used a combination of moral arguments, religious appeals, and economic analysis to build support for emancipation, But they faced fierce resistance from planters and their allies who argued that immediate abolition would destroy colonial prosperity and harm the slaves themselves. The moral arguments about slavery had implications that extended far beyond colonial policy. The principle that human beings could not legitimately be treated as property challenged other forms of social hierarchy and economic exploitation. Factory workers and their advocates drew parallels between wage slavery and chattel slavery, arguing that workers who were economically compelled to accept inadequate wages and dangerous working conditions were not truly free despite their legal status. Colonial products transformed British consumption patterns and cultural practices in ways that became so naturalized as to seem inevitable. Tea, originally a luxury imported from China, had become the national beverage, consumed by people of all social classes and central to British social rituals. Sugar, produced by slave labor in the Caribbean, sweetened this tea and enabled the development of new forms of confectionery and baking that enriched British cuisine. Coffee, cocoa, tobacco, and spices from various colonial sources added variety and pleasure to British life while creating dependencies on distant lands and peoples. The Royal Navy, which protected British merchant shipping and enforced British imperial authority across the oceans, became a source of national pride and cultural identity. Naval victories during the Napoleonic Wars had established British supremacy at sea, and the continuing expansion of the fleet demonstrated national power and technological superiority. The officers and seamen who served in the Navy brought back stories of foreign lands and peoples that fed British curiosity about the wider world while also confirming British assumptions about their own cultural and racial superiority. Scientific exploration, often conducted under naval auspices, extended British knowledge and influence into previously unknown regions. The voyages of Captain James Cook had established precedents for combining scientific investigation with territorial acquisition, and subsequent expeditions to Africa, the Pacific, and the Arctic continued this tradition. These expeditions produced maps, specimens, and ethnographic observations that contributed to scientific knowledge while also identifying opportunities for commercial exploitation and imperial expansion. The cultural impact of empire was particularly visible in London, which by the 1820s had become one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities. The docks along the Thames received ships from every corner of the globe, bringing not only goods but also people who contributed to the city's diversity and cultural richness. Sailors from various nations, colonial administrators on leave, merchants engaged in international trade, and refugees from European political upheavals created a population that was far more diverse than that of most British communities. This diversity generated both excitement and anxiety among British observers. On one hand, London's cosmopolitan character demonstrated British global importance and cultural sophistication. The city's shops offered goods from around the world, its restaurants served exotic cuisines, and its streets provided opportunities to encounter people and cultures that most Britons could only read about. On the other hand, this diversity also raised concerns about national identity and social cohesion. Conservative critics worried that excessive foreign influence might corrupt British character and undermine traditional values. The visual arts during the 1820s reflected both domestic social changes and imperial expansion. Landscape painting, pioneered by artists like John Constable, captured the beauty of the English countryside while also documenting its transformation by agricultural improvement and industrial development. Constable's paintings of Suffolk villages and farmland presented an idealized vision of rural England that appealed to urban audiences who were increasingly removed from agricultural life. Portrait painting remained an important source of income for artists and a way for wealthy families to display their status and commemorate family history. Thomas Lawrence, the most fashionable portrait painter of the era, created images of aristocrats and wealthy merchants that emphasized their dignity and importance while also revealing contemporary standards of beauty and fashion. These portraits served not only as family records but also as social documents that illuminate the values and aspirations of Britain's elite classes. Historical and mythological paintings, though less commercially successful than portraits, provided artists with opportunities to address serious themes and demonstrate their technical skills. Benjamin Haydon's massive canvases depicting biblical and classical subjects attracted public attention and critical acclaim while also raising questions about the role of art in modern society. The tension between artistic ambition and commercial necessity that troubled Haydn and other serious artists reflected broader questions about the place of culture in an increasingly commercial and industrial society. Architecture during the 1820s demonstrated the confidence and ambition of British society while also revealing tensions between tradition and innovation. John Nash's redesign of central London, including the creation of Regent Street and Regent's Park, showed how urban planning could create spaces worthy of an imperial capital while also providing profitable opportunities for property development. These projects combined classical architectural principles with modern urban planning techniques, creating environments that were both beautiful and functional. The Gothic Revival movement, championed by architects like Augustus Pugin, represented a reaction against classical styles and modern urban development. Gothic Revival buildings, with their pointed arches, elaborate decoration, and medieval associations, appealed to people who were nostalgic for a romanticized vision of pre-industrial society. This architectural movement reflected broader cultural tensions between progress and tradition, efficiency and beauty, that characterized British society during this period of rapid change. Industrial architecture, though less celebrated than residential and public buildings, was perhaps more innovative and influential. The mills, factories, and warehouses that housed industrial production required new solutions to problems of lighting, ventilation, and structural support. Engineers like Thomas Telford developed new techniques for building with iron and other materials that made possible structures of unprecedented size and strength. These industrial buildings, though designed primarily for function rather than beauty, created a new aesthetic that would eventually influence architecture throughout the world. Religious architecture reflected the growing diversity of British Christianity and the increasing wealth of dissenting congregations. Methodist chapels, Baptist meeting houses, and other nonconformist religious buildings provided alternatives to traditional Anglican parish churches while also demonstrating the vitality of popular Protestantism. The architectural styles chosen for these buildings often reflected their congregations' social aspirations and theological emphases, with some groups preferring simple, austere designs while others adopted more elaborate decorative schemes. Education was beginning to be recognized as a crucial factor in national progress and social stability. The monitorial schools established by Joseph Lancaster and Andrew Bell provided basic literacy instruction to tens of thousands of children, while the National Society and other religious organizations worked to ensure that education remained grounded in Christian principles. The University of London, established in 1826, offered higher education to students excluded from Oxford and Cambridge by religious tests, creating new opportunities for intellectual development and professional advancement. The expansion of educational opportunities was closely connected to broader questions about social mobility and political participation. Conservatives worried that excessive education might make working people dissatisfied with their station in life and encourage dangerous political ambitions. Reformers argued that education would produce more skilled workers, better citizens, and a more prosperous society. This debate about the purposes and limits of popular education would continue throughout the century, reflecting fundamental disagreements about human nature and social organization. The growth of scientific societies and literary associations provided new forums for intellectual exchange and cultural development. The Royal Institution, the Geological Society, and similar organizations brought together people interested in advancing knowledge while also providing social opportunities for educated middle-class men and women. These institutions helped to create a sense of intellectual community that transcended geographical boundaries and social divisions. Women's participation in intellectual and cultural life was expanding during this period, despite legal and social restrictions that limited their formal opportunities. Female writers like Jane Austen, Maria Edgeworth, and later George Eliot found audiences and achieved recognition for their literary achievements. The growth of ladies' magazines and other publications aimed at female readers created markets for women writers while also providing forums for discussing questions particularly relevant to women's experiences. The evangelical revival that had been gaining strength throughout British society continued to influence cultural development during the 1820s. Evangelical Christians established schools, published religious literature, and organized societies for moral reform that aimed to transform British society according to Christian principles. Their campaigns against slavery, cruel sports, and other practices they considered immoral helped to establish new standards of humanitarian concern while also demonstrating the potential for organized religious groups to influence public policy. By the end of the 1820s, it was becoming clear that Britain had established itself as not only the world's leading industrial power but also a major cultural force whose influence extended far beyond its geographical boundaries. British literature was read throughout Europe and the Americas. British scientific discoveries were reshaping human understanding of the natural world, and British political ideas were inspiring reform movements in other countries. The seeds of future developments were already visible to careful observers. The railway technology that would revolutionize transportation was being tested and improved. The political reform movements that would transform British government were gathering strength and organization. The cultural achievements of the Romantic period were laying foundations for Victorian literature and art. The imperial expansion that would make Britain a global superpower was proceeding steadily across multiple continents. Perhaps most importantly, the fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the proper relationship between individual liberty and collective welfare that had been raised by industrial development remained unresolved. The debates that had begun during the 1820s about working conditions, political representation, educational opportunities, and social responsibility would continue to shape British society for generations to come. The cultural expressions of this decade, its literature, art, music, and intellectual achievements, provided both inspiration and guidance for future generations who would continue the work of building a modern industrial society that could combine material prosperity with human dignity and social justice. The Britain of the 1820s had established patterns of development, industrial, political, cultural, and imperial, that would influence not only British history but the entire course of world civilization. Understanding this crucial decade provides insight into the origins of the modern world and the ongoing challenges of reconciling technological progress with human values, economic development with social equity, and national interests with global responsibilities.